WNYC Studios.
For months, there have been rumors of an investigation by someone into Donald Trump's ties to and behavior in Russia. It finally emerged in full on Buzzfeed, all 35 salacious, unverified pages of a dossier, the work of a British intelligence sleuth.
I think it's a disgrace that information that was false and fake and never happened got released to the public. As far as Buzzfeed, which is a failing pile of garbage, writing it, I think they're going to suffer the consequences. They already are.
This week in Slate, which also hosted the full dossier, writer Will Oremus examined the sticky ethics of Buzzfeed's decision. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, as you noted in your piece, intelligence agencies and media organizations have been sitting on this dossier for a while. Mother Jones alluded to it, but didn't quote extensively from it. The Guardian has written about it. We even had Tim Weiner on the show a few weeks ago, who's written books about the FBI and the CIA, a longtime Times reporter in the past. And he hinted about it, but we didn't run it because we were uncomfortable with the suggestion that there might be some sexual kompromat in Trump's past, and we didn't have any backup for that. So here we go. Why did those organizations that had it, including the Times, not release it in full?
Well, I think a lot of people sat on this information for the same reason that you were uncomfortable with publishing it, which is that in journalism, you want to be extremely careful about running with information, especially explosive allegations about someone when you don't know them to be true. No one has been able to verify a lot of the key facts in this dossier, and just publishing unverified allegations, especially allegations that would be of such great enormity were they to be found true, you don't want to do that unless you have good reason to believe that they are in fact true. So I think most news organizations who had this, and there were quite a few, I don't know that anyone knows the whole list, their rationale was sort of old-fashioned media ethics. We are not going to publish this until we can independently verify the facts therein. Tuesday,
after CNN reported that top U.S. intelligence officials had shown a 2-page summary of the dossier to Obama and Trump, speculation was raised that if it's still unverified or flat out wrong, why was the president and the president-elect briefed on them?
Yeah, and I think, I can't prove it. This was not in BuzzFeed editor Ben Smith's stated rationale for publishing the dossier in full, but I believe that he went ahead and published it on BuzzFeed because of this CNN report. And as you noted, the CNN report indicated that President-elect Trump and President Obama had been briefed on this by top intelligence officials. It's also possible that the Gang of Eight members of Congress had been briefed on it. We don't know that for sure.
And I believe the Guardian reported that John McCain became aware of it and brought it to U.S. intelligence officials?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, John McCain, I don't know if this is literal, but hand-delivered it to FBI Director James Comey, as the story goes. And even before that, Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid had made allusions to this memo. So it's like sort of a legendary thing, apparently, in these circles where everybody whispers about it in hushed tones and nobody can discuss it publicly because, again, the contents are just explosive and we don't know that they're true.
But some reports have suggested that because the past history of this source was credible, reliable, that the U.S. intelligence officials were taking it seriously.
Yeah, and that's the key question here, right? I believe that BuzzFeed saw that CNN report and thought two things. Well, number one, if top intelligence officials took this seriously enough to brief President-elect Trump about it, then that lends it some credibility, right? They wouldn't have done that if it were just fake news, to use the term that President-elect Trump probably inaptly used today to describe the report.
Yeah.
But then I think the second thing that BuzzFeed probably thought was, well, if CNN published that this memo exists, somebody else is going to come out with this if we don't. And I imagine that played a role in their thinking as to whether to publish this. And they, that may be true. It may be that if BuzzFeed hadn't published it first, that someone else ultimately would have published it. But there is this question of how seriously did the intelligence officials take this dossier? Because the CNN report indicates that they did not turn over the 35-page dossier in full to President-elect Trump or President Obama. Rather, they wrote up a 2-page synopsis of some of the claims that were contained in that dossier and appended that as like an unofficial addition to the official classified report on the hackings that were believed to be Russian in origin. So we don't really know exactly how seriously they took it. Obviously, they took it seriously enough to mention it, but whether they mentioned it and said, look, we're really looking into this stuff, it might really be true, or whether they mentioned it and said, look, this might be all bogus, but we just thought you should know that it's going around because you might have heard some senators alluding to it in the hearing clip.
So if that was the intelligence community's view with regard to Trump and Obama, was that also BuzzFeed's view with regard to the rest of us? Because the article did state that Americans can make up their own minds about these allegations and that BuzzFeed didn't stand behind them, didn't do any independent reporting. What did you think about BuzzFeed's statement?
It was really interesting. They started the article with a bunch of caveats. We don't know that this is true. Much of it cannot be verified. And in fact, we know that some stuff in here is wrong. Like there was a misspelling of the Alpha Group, which is an important institution in Russia.
And sometimes Manafort had 2 N's and sometimes 1. I think the misspelling is a bit of a feint.
But BuzzFeed presented it as, we know that this might not be true, so regard it with skepticism, but here is the full unedited document, and we leave it to Americans to make up their own minds. I find that a little disingenuous in a way, because if the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus, not to mention BuzzFeed's own investigative team, can't make up their minds as to whether this is true, how is the average American supposed to make up their mind as to whether any of this is true or whether it's outrageous lies? That part I think was maybe a little hard to stomach.
I think it's even more than hard to stomach. It's almost unbelievably BS-y. In a court of law, a jury, their whole job is to make up their minds. But if information is unverified or false, they're told to disregard it. And here you've basically tainted the public opinion jury pool, as it were. I mean, as if we didn't have enough information to work from when it came to the president-elect.
Yeah, I think you've just made the con side of the case for publishing this pretty strongly. I think to add a word on the pro side, this is a document that is being evaluated and discussed at the highest levels of U.S. government, and it's a document that people are alluding to in public hearings. And so the question that organizations like BuzzFeed and many others were no doubt wrestling with is, we have this information. What is the rationale for not sharing this? I mean, shouldn't we err on the side of disclosing something that's clearly newsworthy, if not because it's true, then at least because it is shaping the political debate and it's shaping what's happening in Washington right now?
I loved how you wrote about the trajectory of this story. It happened via a series of steps by various actors, each of whom relied on the actions of those before them to justify their own decisions. I'm quoting you here, Will. BuzzFeed presumably published it in part because CNN was reporting on it. CNN was reporting on it because intelligence officials had briefed Trump on it. Intelligence officials briefed Trump on it because senior congressional leaders were passing it around. Senior congressional leaders may have been passing it around in part because Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid alluded to it in a letter blasting FBI Director James Comey for publicizing information harmful to Hillary Clinton but not publicizing the dirt on Trump. Each act, you wrote, lowered the bar for those who followed to act on information they knew might or might not be true.
Yeah, and one of the parallels that came to mind immediately when this happened was Matt Drudge, one of the very original political bloggers, published the allegations about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, but the story was not about the allegations per se. The story was framed as Newsweek is sitting on an explosive story about Bill Clinton and an intern. So Drudge justified it by making it a media story and a question about why is Newsweek withholding this information.
And not just Drudge. Let me just say that at that time, I was National Public Radio's media correspondent, and NPR wasn't going to report on the stained dress of Monica Lewinsky, but they did ask me to report on the coverage of the stained dress, by now well-known kind of dodge for taking responsibility for actually covering the story, and I wouldn't do it, and got into a little bit of trouble.
Now that I think about it, isn't it one of the rhetorical maneuvers that is favored by our president-elect, Donald Trump? He always uses that phrase, people are saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this.
But he never identifies them. At least we know in this case who the people are.
We do know who the people are, that's true.
Okay, so in the memo, Smith also said that the decision to publish the full text, quote, reflects how we see the job of reporters in 2017. And that brings us back to Matt Drudge, because one could argue that that was the beginning of the digital age of news transmission.
Yeah, and obviously the ability of anybody with a computer and an internet connection to publish material for all the world to see radically altered the media landscape. It forever changed the angle of the playing field on which these sorts of debates would transpire. But I do think what's interesting is that it's tempting to think we now live in this era where nothing can be secret, where there's no privacy, where media can serve no gatekeeping role, as the journalism ethics phrase has it, because everything is going to get published and information wants to be free, and if we don't publish it, somebody else will. I think it's fascinating, given all of that this took so long to come out. I mean, it took weeks or months of a lot of people knowing this information for it to finally come out to the public. So I think it says that the role of media as gatekeeper it's not totally dead.
Yeah, you wrote, clearly the internet has not turned journalism into a shameless, traffic-thirsty free-for-all. But you did note that though Smith has at times positioned BuzzFeed as a member of the mainstream media, he was acting here in a different tradition. Do you want to distinguish between the mainstream media tradition and this different tradition to which you refer?
Yes. So BuzzFeed gets a funny rap sometimes. It's still remembered by its origins as this site with like animal listicles and quizzes, and of course it does all that. But over the years, obviously, it has become a major news organization in its own right. It has hired investigative journalists from all kinds of reputable outlets around the world. And Ben Smith actually recently lumped BuzzFeed in with the mainstream media in sort of congratulating the mainstream media on their investigative work in the most recent presidential election, that the stories that had the most impact during the campaign were those sort of old-fashioned, shoe-leather, fact-based reports like the Fair and Public investigative reports about the Trump Foundation. And he was including BuzzFeed in that group. But, you know, this is an indication that BuzzFeed does consider itself to be different. I mean, it was born online. It was born in the social media era. And it's part of this other tradition that is separate from the print tradition and the network news tradition, in which there is more of a bias toward publication of material, even if you haven't been able to fully vet it, and in which you dump a document. You'll dump an unedited document online. That's not something that you would often see in print or on the news. You put it out there and you justify it by saying, well, we'll let people make up their own minds. It wasn't just Drudge. Gawker really honed this web ideology whereby there was always a bias in favor of publication. It's a different tradition. It's the web tradition of Drudge and Gawker. And, you know, even now, even today, a day after BuzzFeed published this dossier, we still have CNN declining to discuss the details of its content.
So what are the stakes, pro and con, for release or not releasing?
There are big stakes here. And one of the potential upsides is, you know, sometimes you have this information, it's floating around, people are investigating it, and they're getting nowhere. But once it becomes public, all of a sudden, you know, anybody in the world can step in and say, well, I know this guy wasn't in Prague when the report said he was in Prague, and people can step forward with information, and suddenly a mystery that looked like it was insoluble can get pretty quickly resolved. So maybe that happens. Maybe now we will be able to learn the truth. So that could be a good outcome. On the downside, I mean, if this all turns out to be laughably false and demonstrably untrue, it looks really bad for BuzzFeed. It looks bad for everybody else who jumped on it, for all the people in the media who were on Twitter immediately afterward making lewd jokes about the allegations. And it just reinforces the conservative narrative right now, which is that the mainstream media is in no place to throw stones because you can't trust them at all either.
Although Trump, in his last president-elect press conference, praised the mainstream media for their forbearance.
Yeah, the press conference was fascinating because President-elect Trump, as you said, he praised all of the outlets except for the two that he singled out for criticism, and that was BuzzFeed and CNN. Then interestingly, CNN, right after the press conference, the first thing Jake Tapper did was to say, look, we did not publish the contents of this dossier. We just reported that it was out there. And he said that what President-elect Trump had implied was untrue. And in fact, he went on to distance CNN from Buzzfeed and sort of threw Buzzfeed under the bus and said, look, they're the ones that publish this stuff, not us. Don't be mad at us.
Well, what do you think about how CNN handled the material? I mean, I'm okay with them referring to something floating around the Hill. That doesn't really taint the jury pool in any huge way. Certainly no more than Comey did with referring to a reopened investigation into Hillary's emails. It's something that is happening. They didn't dive into the grisly details.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Trump had singled them out for criticism and in fact refused to even answer their questions at the press conference because, as you said, CNN did do this the old-fashioned way. They did it by the book. They reported what they were able to nail down, or at least they thought they had nailed down, which is that this dossier existed and that it had been briefed to President-elect Trump, and they did not report any of the stuff that they weren't able to independently verify. I think it's hard to take issue with the way CNN handled this, except maybe the part where they then, after being criticized by President Trump, turned around and pointed the finger at BuzzFeed and said, no, it's those guys. Go after those guys.
Even assuming that these allegations against Trump that are in the dossier ultimately will be verified, let's just say that as a point of argument, it's still distracting us now during these news cycles about what it is that he plans to do when he gets into office, about Obamacare, about paying for the wall across the southern border, about maintaining or not maintaining the sanctions against Russia, all of these issues that he's working on right now, not to mention the point of that press conference, which was all about his conflicts of interest. Isn't this just serving as a monumental distraction at precisely the wrong time?
Isn't everything? I mean, it is fascinating. I saw someone describe it, and I apologize that I'm not going to be able to properly credit them right here, but I saw someone describe it as though the Trump campaign was a denial of service attack on the entire media. And a denial of service attack being that thing where you enlist, so many computer bots to request information from the same server at once that the whole system crashes. I mean, Trump kind of does that to the media. He's found a sort of loophole whereby if you have enough outrageous stuff going on at once, there's no way that the media can possibly keep up with all of it. And all of it ends up getting covered less than it would otherwise.
Slate also released the 35-page dossier.
Slate did release the 35-page dossier, and it happened while I was writing about BuzzFeed's decision to release the 35-page dossier. So I did what I think any reporter would do. I immediately emailed our editor-in-chief, Julia Turner, requesting comment. Why did you publish this dossier? I was obviously not part of that decision. But what she said is they're newsworthy documents, and then BuzzFeed's decision to publish was news too.
Yeah, but that's publishing on BuzzFeed publishing isn't the same as publishing yourself.
And then, of course, that's what we've been talking about this entire time, and that's how these stories proliferate. That's how the bar gets progressively lowered, is that the fact that people are talking about it becomes news in itself. And then the fact that it's news, justifies other people talking about it and so on.
So you disagree with Julia there?
I actually, not because we published it, but for my own reasons, I did not take a strong stand pro or con in my piece about BuzzFeed's decision to publish this or about Slate's decision to publish this. I think anybody who sees this as cut and dry, that BuzzFeed was either obviously right or obviously wrong, is not considering all the pros and cons here. I think by journalism ethics, BuzzFeed made the wrong decision. I might argue that Slate made the wrong decision too, but there are some cases in which putting information out there can have positive consequences for the world that sort of transcend narrow questions of journalism ethics. I think that is why journalists in general are taught to have a bias in favor of publishing information. Of course, they don't want to publish stuff that they know not to be true.
And do you think this may be one of those cases?
This is a good question. You're doing very well to pin me down here. I think if it were me, I probably would not have made that call to publish without having greater confidence in the substance of the report. I can certainly see a strong argument for doing so. And again, I think this is why journalists have a bias toward publication, because people in power have a bias against embarrassing stuff being published. And that is part of the role of journalists in the society, is to serve as a counterweight to the forces of secrecy and behind-the-scenes manipulation and cover-ups. So, it's a really tough question, and this is incredibly weaselly, but I am not going to say that I know for sure that it was the right or the wrong call.
I think we can all agree, however, that they were really fun to read.
and that Ben Smith will never tell you that could have played any possible role in publishing this. And I think, to BuzzFeed's credit, they make their editorial decisions on much more serious grounds than that. But it is not going to stop some people from wondering just how much traffic and notoriety did BuzzFeed get out of this, and does Slate get out of publishing it, and anybody else who talks about this sort of salacious material. There's that question of the business incentives to get people talking about the stuff that's in your magazine or on your channel.
Will, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brooke.
Will Oremus is a senior writer for Slate. This is an On the Media podcast. I'm Brooke Gladstone.